She clutched her apron tightly whenever he approached with an authoritative voice. In front of everyone, it was only the maid who had to lower her eyes and obey. But when the house fell silent and the world slept, she was his refuge, and he her hidden love. No touch happened in the daylight, no glance lasted long enough to be noticed. But in the silent dawns, she stroked his hair as if she were guarding an eternal secret. Until one day, when he finally woke up to the truth that he hid beneath. His own feet, she was no longer there, and the silence that remained was louder than any cry of unlived love. She didn't have a headline-worthy surname, nor a dress that would draw attention in the salons of high society, but she had a soul, and that scared him more than any scandal, because deep down he knew that only in her arms did he feel whole. He commanded her during the day to hide how much he needed her at night, and she accepted it all in silence, out of love, out of fear, or maybe because she knew she was loving a man who would never choose her over others, until something inside her changed, not with anger, but with self-love. And when he reached out to take her back, he found only a cold pillow and a note that said, "I left so I wouldn't die in pieces that you only visit when no one sees." If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. The house had an elegant silence. Everything was in its place. Every luxury object reflected the calculated coldness of someone who never had to ask twice to be obeyed. It was an imposing white mansion, surrounded by gardens that had never seen disarray. In the United States, in a region where family names were still worth more than any sincere emotion, lived William R. Blake, a widower, businessman, discreet, the kind of man who inspired respect and fear in equal measure, his eyes always carrying a weight that no one dared interpret. Clara, on the other hand, was like the morning breeze coming through the windows before anyone noticed. Silent, dedicated, observant. She had worked there for almost 3 years as a maid, but she had never been seen as part of the house. She followed his routine exactly, knew where he left his glasses, how he liked his coffee, the name of the dog he had lost, and even what made him shiver during sleepless nights. She came from far away, from the south, and carried in her eyes a discreet and firm sweetness, like someone who had already learned to survive many silences. Every morning she arrived before the sun. She walked through the side door, put on her apron, and began to dance with her tasks as if she were part of the furniture. But William saw her, even if he pretended not to notice. He watched her from afar, from above, from behind the columns or the newspapers, never touching his words where he shouldn't. And yet, something in him changed on the days when Clara smiled. It was almost imperceptible, but it changed. In his eyes, in his posture, in the way he lingered longer at the breakfast table when he knew she was nearby. There was never a touch, a kiss, or even a more intimate word in front of anyone. It was as if that love, if it could be called that, had grown in a place where the sun could not reach, a corner of shadow and desire hidden between orders and swallowed sighs. He, with the pose of someone who dominates everything, only knew how to allow himself to be vulnerable when the house was asleep, and she, even hearing her own heart beat faster, knew that that feeling had a time to happen. Because for him, she was Clara, the cleaning lady, until everyone left. It was on one of those nights that everything began to change. William had come down earlier than usual, his eyes less cold, and his breathing heavy, as if he was running away from something he couldn't even name. He found Clara, sitting in the kitchen, reading a book with her feet bare, and an expression of peace that he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. He stood there, watching her for a few seconds, until she noticed his presence and stood up with her usual respectful haste. This time he asked her to stay. That was it. Stay. He didn't say anything else. There was no need. Clara obeyed, but not as an employee, but as someone who feels that for a moment the world can stop pretending. She stayed, not out of obedience, but because something in his voice sounded different this time. William didn't seem like the distant and proud boss, but rather a man trying, even if he didn't know how, to stay where life still made some sense. He sat at the table opposite hers, and for a moment they were both silent. The kitchen clock made a soft sound, marking the time that dragged on between two worlds, his of command and coldness, and hers of silence and care. On the counter, the book was still open, and next to it, the mug of tea already cold. He pointed to the cover of the book and asked, without looking directly at her, "Do you like to read?" She answered only with a soft yes, but her look said much more. It said that she had read too much to be able to understand men like him. That night, there was no touching, no confession, no confusion, just a kind of companionship that doesn't need words. She stood there, and so did he. No disguises. William watched the way Clara held the book, how her fingers moved calmly, as if time didn't rush her. And in that moment he realized that it had been a long time since he had paid attention to anyone like that. Not because he didn't want to, but because his world didn't allow it. Feeling was a weakness that he avoided with contracts, figures, and control. The next morning he came down again, and again. Sometimes I would just sit next to her while she prepared something to eat. Sometimes they would exchange 2 or 3 words, but something new was growing there. It wasn't an urgent passion. It was something deeper, slower, more dangerous, because it was born in the most vulnerable place, between need and silence. And each night it left invisible marks on Clara's chest. She began to wake up, missing what she didn't even know if she could call love, and he, without even admitting it, began to climb the stairs, wondering if she was awake. One night, Clara noticed that William had a different kind of anguish in his eyes. He didn't hide it. He sat down, looked out the window and said in a heavy voice, "Today marks 4 years since my wife died." She didn't answer. She just got up, made tea, sat down next to him, and remained silent. A silence that said, "I hear your pain, even if you don't know how to cry." And he felt it. For the first time in a long time, someone was there, not out of interest, not out of obligation, but out of presence. That's all. Clara saw him close his eyes, let out a long sigh, as if releasing an old weight, and she, without realizing it, placed her hand on his. He didn't push it away. The next night he didn't come down, or the night after that, and Clara wondered if she had crossed an invisible line. But on the 4th night he reappeared, and in his hands he held a book wrapped in a simple ribbon. "I thought you might like it." She held the gift with the care of someone holding a secret. It was the same author as the book she had been reading a few days before, an old edition that was hard to find. She smiled. He smiled back, but he was still her boss. He was still William R. Blake, the man who had to keep the whole world under control, including his own heart. But there, among tea, books, and eyes that sought each other without permission, something had already been planted, and no social mask could undo what was growing in the dark. What had begun as silent encounters began to shape their invisible routine. Clara, who had previously only followed orders during the day, now also filled in the gaps during the early hours of the morning. But it wasn't servitude, but rather a nameless surrender, a presence that had become indispensable. William was beginning to let her spend more time with her books, more time with him. He trusted her with details of the house that had previously been delegated to others. The kitchen became a refuge, the early hours of the morning a confessional, and his heart, even if he didn't admit it, became more and more hers. But as the day wore on, the disguise returned. In the presence of employees, friends, and occasional visitors, William maintained the same dry tone, the same distance. Clara was treated as she had always been, the polite girl who knew her place, and that hurt her. Perhaps more than if he had never shown anything, because now she knew the man behind her boss. She knew his pain, his fragility, the warmth he sought in her arms when the world slept. And yet, she was forced to pretend that none of that existed, not out of fear, but because he chose not to see. One afternoon, a longtime friend of William's showed up at the house, an arrogant, well-dressed man with the kind of smile that passes through people like Clara without ever really seeing them. She served the coffee with her usual poise, but inside she was trembling. The friend made jokes that insinuated her beauty as if she were a curious piece of furniture in the house, and William laughed. He laughed so as not to displease. He laughed as if he had not spent nights with her, as if he had not cried in her lap when he spoke of his deceased wife. Clara held back her tears with her teeth. When she had finished, she gathered up the cups and went up to the room she occupied upstairs, where no one entered, where no one saw her. That night William showed up later than usual. He knocked on the door, she opened it, but there was no tenderness in her eyes, only tiredness. He asked if everything was okay, and she answered in a low voice, "You see me when the world sleeps, but I exist all day long." He tried to justify himself, saying that he needed to keep up appearances, that things were complicated, that people wouldn't understand. She just nodded, without arguing. She had already learned that arguing with someone who hasn't yet had the courage to look in the mirror is like talking to walls. Even so, she kept going. She kept going into the early hours of the morning. She kept taking care of him. She kept believing that maybe love could make him change. But deep down, something inside her was starting to break. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was the beginning of a lucidity that frightens. The lucidity of knowing that it's not love that's missing, but respect. And that no surviving love deserves to live in the dark forever. The arrival of autumn brought more than just a chill to the mansion's windows. It brought a formal invitation from William to an important business dinner. The event would be held at the house, and he demanded perfection in every detail. Clara coordinated everything with the same dedication as always. Plates lined up with precision, silverware polished with care, wines positioned as etiquette dictated. She knew she wouldn't be part of the table, but this was his world, and she had learned to dance behind the scenes even when her heart wanted to sit at the front. That night, she dressed in her uniform with more care than usual, not out of vanity, but out of a last secret hope that he would see her as a man, not as a boss. The guests began to arrive. Men in suits, perfumed women, practiced smiles, conversations about figures and inheritances. Clara moved around the room like a breeze, serving glasses, clearing plates, lowering her eyes whenever one of them spoke to her as if she were no one. When William appeared, dressed in an impeccable dark suit with that air of absolute control, Clara felt her heart race. For a second, he saw her. Their eyes met, and then he looked away, as if nothing existed there, as if she were just another functional piece in the theater of his life. During dinner, he heard one of the businessmen comment on the pretty brunette in the kitchen. They laughed. William said nothing. He didn't defend her. He didn't take back the joke. And when she passed by the table to serve wine, he heard another say, "That one must be worth more at night, don't you think, William?" The laughter that came next was what cut the deepest. He didn't correct her. He didn't reprimand her. He just laughed briefly, as if it were just another conversation between men. And Clara knew at that very moment that what she felt was not reciprocated love. It was a lonely addiction to giving herself to someone who only wanted her in the shadows. After the guests had left, the house seemed colder than ever. Clara went to the kitchen, took off her apron with tears in her eyes, and slowly climbed the stairs. She knew he would come, and he did. Hours later, with the same expression as always, wanting to sit next to her, wanting her presence, her silence, her touch. But this time, Clara was not waiting tenderly. When she opened the door, her eyes were distant. He approached, tried to hold her hands, but she gently pulled away and said only, "Love that has no courage is no longer useful to me." He stood there, not understanding. He tried to say that it was just the way things were, that this world had rules. But she smiled sadly and added, "Your world may have rules, but mine has learned that to be love it has to have a face, and mine only exists when you sleep." William stepped back. For the first time he felt that he was no longer in control of the situation, and that scared him more than any bankruptcy. That night there was no tea, no conversation, no eyes shining in the dawn. There was silence, but not the same silence as before. Now it was the silence of something beginning to die. In the days that followed, Clara returned to her routine. With the precision of an old clock, she cleaned, organized, cooked, and collected the pieces from the board of a house she knew better than her own name. But now, everything was different. There were no more low-key conversations at night, nor the furtive glances in the hallway. William avoided going downstairs, and when he did, his steps carried a dense discomfort, as if Clara's presence reminded him of something he would rather forget, or didn't yet know how to face. She, in turn, showed no anger. She didn't cry. She just kept going. But every gesture carried an invisible farewell, and William felt it. He tried to get closer with small gestures. He left a note on the table with a quote from a book. Then, a sweet she liked. Even a bouquet left on the sideboard with a clumsy ribbon. But Clara didn't react. She neither despised nor thanked him. She simply continued to exist inside that house as if her soul had already moved somewhere else. And it was precisely this serene absence that destabilized him the most, because her silence was now a choice, not submission. On the third night away, William went to her room. He knocked. He waited. She opened the door, her hair loose, her face clean, dressed simply as always, but something about her glowed with new strength. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. Then he held out his hand. She looked at that hand that had so often sought shelter in her arms and said, "I don't hate you, William. I just understood that loving someone in secret is dying a little each day." He said he missed her, that everything was confusing, that he didn't know how to deal with his own feelings. She nodded tenderly, but firmly. "I missed myself too. Me." He wanted to hold her. He wanted to promise her things. But Clara knew. She knew that promises made when someone is afraid of losing rarely survive the dawn of day. So he closed the door gently. And it was only then that he realized the true sound of loss, the silence of a woman who no longer waits. In the days that followed, her absence grew in every corner of the house, the neatly made bed, the set table, the tea left at the right time. Everything was there. But the soul was missing. William spent more time in the office, went out less, talked to fewer people, and on a rare impulse he tried to talk to his older sister, asking for advice on complicated relationships. But he didn't have the courage to mention that it was with Clara. He still couldn't name what he felt, because naming it meant acknowledging that he had lost the only thing that made him human. That same week, while cleaning out one of the rarely used rooms, Clara found a box of old letters from William. Letters from when I was young, when I wrote with emotion, when I still believed that feelings could be confessed on paper. She read one or two, smiled with a kind of sad tenderness, and then put them all back, as if she understood that some people only know how to love in the past. And at that exact moment, without knowing that she had read the letters, William felt a strange weight in his chest, as if something was being sealed, a cycle, a story, or perhaps a heart, which he only learned to hear when the other's voice had already fallen silent. The mornings were as they had been before, at least at first glance. Clara organized the house with the same precision she had always had, but she was no longer invisible. Not because William looked at her differently, but because now she was the one who saw herself with different eyes. Each of her steps was firmer, each gesture more serene. There was no more hesitation in her presence. She was there by choice, no longer out of attachment. And it was this silent lightness that disconcerted William the most. He passed her in the hallways as if expecting punishment, a confrontation, a tear, but there was nothing. And this nothing weighed more than any scream. He tried to get his nighttime routine back. He would come to the kitchen at random times, making up excuses to ask for something he had never asked for before. Once he asked for help choosing a birthday present for his niece. Another time, he asked what perfume Clara wore. He said he wanted to give it to an office worker. She answered kindly, but her eyes no longer lingered on his, as if they no longer belonged together, as if that version of her he loved in the dark had died and been reborn whole, but far away. One of those nights, William brought wine. He poured 2 glasses. She hesitated but sat down. They talked for almost an hour. He talked about business, about a new investment. She listened, but responded little, until he touched her wrist, lightly. He said, "I miss you." Clara remained silent. Then she gently removed her arm and replied, "You miss the version of me that loved you in secret, but I am no longer her." He tried to insist. He said that he felt something real, that he was trying to change. And she, with a firm and sweet look, replied, "You are still trying to control what you do not understand. I loved you, but now I love myself too, and that changes everything." The next morning, William went into his office and sat there for hours, looking at the papers as if they were mazes. He began to re-evaluate meetings, projects, people. Everything seemed to lose its luster. Nothing weighed more heavily than the emptiness that was growing inside him. For the first time, his home felt like a prison, not a kingdom. The large rooms, the Persian rugs, the gilded frames, everything seemed to speak with Clara's voice, but she herself spoke less and less, and when she did speak, it was only as an employee. That Saturday afternoon, Clara came downstairs with a small suitcase. She said she was going to visit an aunt for a few days. She asked for time off. He asked how long she would stay. She said she didn't know yet. William felt the world spin slowly. He wanted to ask if she would come back. He wanted to hold her wrist like he did. On cold nights he wanted to say stay, but he remained silent. Because deep down he knew that his silence, the silence of so many days, so many dinners, so many averted glances, was now the answer she had finally learned to hear. She left. And for the first time since his wife had died, William felt afraid of being alone. But this time, it wasn't the loneliness of widowhood. It was the loneliness of being alive and yet not having the courage to love properly. The kind of loneliness that can't be cured with cups, with power, with status. The loneliness of someone who had love at home and chose to treat it as a secret. William spent the next few days as if he were walking through a place where everything was out of place, although visually intact. The servants avoided his gaze, not out of fear but out of compassion. They knew that something had changed in the boss, even if they didn't understand exactly what. He, in turn, began to frequent areas of the house that he had previously ignored. He spent time in the garden where he never set foot, just to remember the moments when he saw Clara watering the plants with the care of someone talking to each leaf. He opened the piano in the living room, even though he didn't know how to play, just to touch the keys as if searching for a sound he had never heard. And every time he sat at the table, he expected to hear the sound of the cups approaching with that soft clink that only Clara could make. On the 5th day, without news, he sent her a short message. "Is everything okay?" She replied hours later, "Yes, it is." Nothing more. William stared at his cell phone, as if the screen could offer him something that the message did not. He felt angry, but not at her, at himself, for not having had the courage to call her by name when he had the chance, for not having defended her, protected her, acknowledged her. Love, he now understood, was something that could not be hidden out of shame. If it had to be a secret, it was a prison, and he had been the jailer of his own happiness. On the 6th day he bought a ticket to the city, where she had said she had family. He didn't think twice. He asked the driver not to tell anyone. He arrived without flowers, without a speech, without a plan. Only with the certainty that he could not continue breathing with that hole in his chest. He walked the streets like an ordinary man, asking for her in small shops, described with soft features, a girl with dark eyes and a calm voice. Until a lady recognized him from the television. She said she knew who Clara was and that she had left that morning. She said she was going far away, where no one would treat her like a shadow anymore. William felt his legs give out. Back at the mansion, everything seemed darker. The lamps were the same, the furniture in the same places, but it was as if the light had moved with her. She tried to write a letter, then two. Then she tore them all up. She didn't know how to apologize to. Someone she had loved in silence and whom he had never had the courage to name. She sent flowers, tried to call, waited. But Clara didn't answer. Not out of revenge, but because she had already chosen to move on. And on that seventh day, the seventh day of absence, William understood. What hurt the most was not that she had left, it was that she had done it without having to scream. Because when a woman leaves in silence, it is because she has already screamed inside so many times that the whole world chose not to hear. Time passed unevenly inside that house. The clocks marked the hours, but William no longer felt the rhythm of the days. He had lost his appetite. The commitments, which had previously been meticulously fulfilled, began to be postponed. The partners noticed, the employees murmured, but no one dared to ask. It was as if there was an undeclared mourning hanging in the air. The mourning of someone who was still alive, but who would never return. An absence that could not be explained by death, but by detachment, and that was even more devastating, because living knowing that the other person chose to leave in peace is more painful than losing them tragically. William would stop at the library window every day at 5 o'clock. It was the time when Clara usually went out to water the plants. He no longer saw flowers being tended, but his mind filled the void with involuntary memories. He began to relive the small gestures, the way she folded the cloths, the way she arranged the slightly crooked pictures, the way she whispered songs that she didn't even know she was singing. It was in these details that Clara still lived, but not for him, only inside him. In a desperate attempt to reverse his loneliness, William hired another employee, young, competent, but cold, not because she was bad, but because he wouldn't let her get close. With every gesture she made, he compared her to Clara. It wasn't fair, he knew, but it was inevitable. And with every comparison, I missed her more. I felt more remorse. He started going to places where she might have gone, cafes she liked, small bookstores, local fairs. In one of them, he found a book with a dedication written by Clara years ago. To myself, may I never forget who I am, even when love tries to hide me. The owner of the second-hand bookstore said that someone had left it there as a donation. William bought the book without hesitation. He took it home as if it were a relic, and he started rereading that sentence every day. One afternoon, he found one of Clara's handkerchiefs in the library, forgotten between the pages of an old book. He picked up the fabric as if it were too fragile to be touched. He put it to his face. He closed his eyes. And there, alone, he whispered out loud for the first time, "Forgive me." The sentence hung in the air, unanswered. But it was not meant to be answered. It was the kind of request that comes too late, when the other person has already learned to live without the pain that silence causes. That night William went up to her room. The room remained as she had left it, untouched. He sat up in bed, looked around and felt something strange. For the first time, he was the stranger there. That space was no longer his. It never had been. He had only passed by as a visitor of a love he had never had the courage to declare in the light of day. And it was in that recognition that he understood. Clara was no longer an absence. She was a mirror. That now made him see who he really was, a man who had lost love for fear of exposing what he felt. He woke up with a strange feeling. There was a restlessness that didn't come from external noises, but from within, as if time was pushing him to make one last gesture. He got up earlier than usual, shaved calmly, and chose an outfit he hadn't worn in months. That day, William Blake was determined. He would go after her. Not with promises, not with gifts, only with the truth. He wanted Clara to know somehow that he had seen her late, but whole. He got into the car with an address written on a piece of paper. It wasn't exact, but it was the closest he could find. It was a simple house in the countryside where they said Clara had relatives. The road was long, and the landscape seemed to speak to him all the time. Open fields, clear skies, dry trees, everything brought back memories of her face under the kitchen light, of the early mornings when they became two humans, stripped of social roles. When he arrived, he found a lady sitting on the porch. She recognized him immediately but showed no surprise. She just pointed to the bench next to her as if she had been waiting for this reunion that would not be hers. William asked about Clara. The woman smiled sadly and said, "She's gone, but she left something." She went into the house and came back with a brown envelope. She said if you came, I should give you this. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a note. Simple. Unadorned, unsigned. If one day you look for me, don't come and promise me what you didn't have the courage to live. I already chose myself, and that's more than you ever had to offer. He read it once, then again, and he stood there, as if listening to a sentence. The woman next to him added gently, she learned that love doesn't need to be hidden to be true, and that when we become a secret in someone else's life, it's time to be evident in our own. William didn't insist. He thanked her, his voice catching in his throat, and got back in the car. The trip back was silent. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't answer phone calls. He just drove in silence, with the note by his side, as if it were company. When he got home, he asked the servants to leave him alone for a while. He went up to the library and put Clara's note inside the book, with the inscription he had found days before. Then he sat down in the armchair, where she used to rest when she waited for the nights to pass. And there, for the first time, he cried. Not a desperate cry, but the kind of cry that comes when there is nothing left to fight for, only to accept. He finally understood that love is not about keeping someone in the shadows. It's about having the courage to shine together, even when the whole world is watching. And Clara had learned this before him. That's why he left. That's why he didn't look back. The days passed with the slowness that only guilt knows. William never looked for her again. Not out of resignation, but because he understood that there was nothing left to take back. She was the one who had chosen to leave, and this time through the front door. The house gradually became silent. Dinners, once full of guests, became solitary and quick meals. The lights in the main room were turned off at night. The hallways echoed with her own footsteps, and the kitchen clock, the same one that marked the early hours when she read, seemed to mock her absence with each prolonged tick. One late afternoon, William received a visit from an old business friend. They sat on the porch with 2 glasses of whiskey, but the conversation did not flow. The friend commented that he saw him more dejected, more human, as he put it with a half-smile. William did not respond. He was tired of keeping up appearances, of pretending that what he had lost was just a boss's whim. What he had lost was not just Clara, it was the opportunity to love someone without disguises. And now all he had to do was learn to live with the memory. He began writing in notebooks that he had previously used for meeting notes, not as a writer, but as someone who needed to get out everything he had not had the courage to say when there was still time. He wrote about his fear of being seen as vulnerable, about his pride, about how he had allowed the outside world to dictate the value of his feelings. On one of those pages, he scribbled, "I loved her, with everything I had in me, but I only realized that when she loved herself enough to leave me." He kept these notebooks in a drawer in the library. No one knew. It was the space where he finally took off his mask. There, he was just a man who had everything except courage. And now courage was the only thing he wished he had had, because there was no greater pain than knowing that Clara would have stayed, if he had called out to her out loud, if he had held her hand in the daylight, not just in the darkness of the key room. But opportunities don't scream twice. They whisper, and then they're gone. One of those days, when he opened an old box of memories, he found one of the oldest photos in the house. They were all there, the servants, the gardeners, the drivers, and in the corner, almost hidden in the shadows, was Clara. He enlarged the image. He looked at every detail, the way she leaned to the side, as if avoiding being seen, as if she knew she would never be the center of anything there. But her eyes were turned to him, a sweet but tired look, a look that said, "I'm here, but not for long." It was that night that William decided to keep the house open, not as before, full of parties and empty people, but as a space where I could live with what was left, memories and silence. He had that photo framed and placed it on the fireplace, not to idolize it, but to remind me every day that love demands presence, and that sometimes absence becomes the greatest testimony of a love not recognized in time. The seasons changed, but inside the mansion time seemed to stand still. William began to walk slowly, as if each step carried memories. He stopped going to the company. He began to work from home when he worked at all. The oldest employees began to resign, citing personal issues. The house gradually emptied, as if the echo of what had existed there was asking for space for absolute silence. The only thing that remained untouched was the photo above the fireplace, the one where Clara barely appeared, but where her gaze was the only one alive. He started going out in the mornings. He walked aimlessly. He sat on park benches. He watched children playing, couples arguing quietly, ladies watering plants. None of this belonged to him, but it all hurt, because he was beginning to realize how much he had ignored the value of the ordinary, of the simple, of what made no noise. Clara's love never shouted. It was gentle, it was presence, it was offering. And because it was so gentle, William thought it would last forever. But now he knew. The quietest loves are the ones that are most silent when they realize they are not seen. One morning, as he passed a small bookstore, he saw a display window with photographs of a local exhibition. One image caught his eye. It was a woman with her back turned, reading by a river. There was something familiar about that pose. He went in. He asked the clerk about the exhibition. The young man smiled and said that they were photographs by a new artist who portrayed scenes of ordinary life with rare delicacy. The one in the display window, he said, is her mother. Her name is Clara. William froze. He asked to see more, and there, in other paintings, he saw fragments of the life he had lost. A woman smiling with flowers in her hands, caring for a child, dancing alone in a backyard. He bought all the photos in silence. He asked for them to be carefully packaged. The attendant didn't ask any questions. He simply handed them over with a gesture of respect. As he left, William took a deep breath, and for the first time in months he felt something other than pain. He felt gratitude. Clara was alive. She was well. She was moving on. No hurt, no anger, just living as she had always lived, truthfully. And now, through the lens of her daughter, she was finally seen in the spotlight she never had, when she lived hidden away in the corners of her home. When he arrived at the mansion, he chose a room that Clara never entered, the living room where he used to receive those who ignored her. There he hung the photos, one by one, and he transformed that space into a silent altar, not to worship a regret, but to testify every day that love does not die. It only changes address when it is neglected. Mornings became rituals. William would wake up early, make his own coffee, and sit in front of the photos in the living room before the sun had even reached the marble floor. No one lived with him anymore. The last employees had left weeks ago. He had said he didn't need help, that he was fine. But deep down he knew that the silence was both punishment and comfort. Every detail of the house screamed Clara's absence. The flowers she used to change weekly now slowly wilted in abandoned vases. The books she had rearranged remained there, static, as if afraid of being moved by hands other than hers. He began writing letters he would never send. Some were long, some were short, but they all ended with the same sentence: "I saw you too late." They were the words of a man who had learned that love does not survive in the basement of priorities, and that loving someone in secret, as he had done, was to condemn that person to disappear in silence. One night of light rain, William went out aimlessly with one of the notebooks under his arm. He walked to a small church nearby where there was rarely any movement. He went in, sat on the last bench, and remained still for almost an hour. The priest, who recognized him from afar, said nothing. He just left a candle lit on the altar. William did not pray. He just looked at the flame as if it were condensed, the last part of what he still felt. When he left the notebook on the bench. Someone would find it. Someone might read it. But Clara, he knew, no longer needed words. She had already listened to everything with her body when he only spoke with silence. In the following days, he began to walk less. His body no longer obeyed as before. His hands trembled when he lifted objects. His head ached with memories that had never gone away. One day he tripped while climbing the stairs. He didn't hurt himself, but he remained there, sitting on the second step, staring into space. For the first time he felt old, not because of age, but because of the tiredness of what he had not experienced. Regret is a cruel inheritance. It ages the soul more than the years. And William finally accepted this. That weekend, a young woman rang the doorbell at the mansion. She was the photographer for the exhibition. She was carrying an envelope with a small card. She said that Clara had asked her to give it to him if she ever met William. He held the paper as if he were holding a fragment of something that was once eternal. The note contained only 4 lines. "Thank you for everything you didn't say. I heard you anyway. Don't look for me. I am at peace. May you be too." He didn't cry. He just took the note to his heart. He went up to the library, placed it next to the photo in which she barely appeared, and sat down. He finally understood that this was his last chance to love, even if alone, even if in silence. And, perhaps, the most sincere love he had ever felt was the one that now only knew how to keep alive within regret. The following spring, the mansion seemed like a sleeping shrine. The windows opened to the wind, but there were no voices. The garden, overgrown with weeds, had a forgotten beauty, as if nature had decided to bloom without permission. William no longer received visitors, answered phone calls, or attended meetings. But there was a peace in the way he walked from room to room, as if he were finally coming to terms with the truth of himself, although too late. Every morning he sat in the room where he had hung the photographs from the exhibition. He looked at the paintings as if he were watching a life he had never lived. One day, the postman left a package with no return address. It was a simple cardboard box wrapped in cloth tape. When he opened it, he found something that made his chest stop for a moment: the apron that Clara had worn in the mansion, folded with precision, and next to it, a photo he had never seen before. Clara, in an open field with a calm smile and her gaze turned far away, as if she saw a future that no one else needed to reach. There was no note, no explanation, just the symbol. William understood. This was not a provocation. It was a liberation. Clara had kept the apron not as a memento of her work, but as a reminder of where she had been reborn. And now she was giving it back, as if she were ending a cycle with ease, without demanding debt, without dragging guilt. It was her silence once again teaching him what he had never learned with shouts. It was love, but no longer for him. The next day, William left with Clara's portrait in his hands. He walked through a park far from the city, the same one she had mentioned one morning, saying that one day she would live near there, where people smiled for no reason. He sat down on a wooden bench and stayed there for hours. Late in the afternoon, a little girl with dark hair ran through the trees and tripped near his feet. He helped her up. She smiled. And behind her a woman walked calmly. For a second the world stopped. The woman was not Clara, but her eyes had the same shine. She thanked him, took her daughter by the hand, and walked on, unaware that she had just crossed paths with the man who still carried an entire universe within him. William remained there, motionless. For the first time he did not cry. He just smiled. A brief, fragile smile, but real. Because in that moment he understood that Clara had chosen to live. And that perhaps, just perhaps, that silent gesture, sending the apron, the photo, that last absence, was the most generous gift he had ever received. The permission to also move on, without her, but with everything she had taught him. When he returned home, he removed all the paintings from the living room except one, the one of Clara by the river. He put the rest away, not out of forgetfulness, but out of respect. Then he took his apron and hung it on the back of the kitchen door, as if he still expected her to come in and take it back. He knew that would not happen. But there, in that forgotten door, now lived a kind of faith, not in reunion, but in repentance, transformed into sacred silence. And so the days went by. William wrote less, walked less, but felt more. The pain no longer screamed, it just pulsed, like a farewell song that no one hears, but echoes throughout the house. Until one morning, already old, he was found asleep in the library chair, with Clara's favorite book on his lap, and an expression of peace on his face, as if he had finally been forgiven without having to hear it. Because sometimes true forgiveness doesn't come in words. It comes in the way the other person moves on, without you, but Whole. If this story touched your heart in any way, please leave a like now. It helps us continue to bring you stories that speak where words cannot. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes that will thrill you even more. And tell me here in the comments, have you ever loved someone in silence? Your story can heal someone else. Now, the video that is appearing on your screen is as intense as this one. Click and watch now. The next story could be yours.